And Rafe will now present us his research on the new sensory lexicon for Liberica coffees, insight into the sensory attributes of the different origins, processing methods, elevation, and roasting. So the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Lakemoy, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Dr. Stefan Schwartz, for inviting me, and Michelle for arranging everything. It's been very nice and professional. Yeah, I feel like I'm back in university. Yes. First of all, I apologize for the long-winded title. It's meant to be for the preceding paper, so you may expect some very different content from the title, but not far, I promise. So first, a little bit about myself. You can call me Raven, and me and my partner Kenny are both here. We came from Borneo, Malaysia, so we have a coffee business, a coffee academy, and roastery there. And we are very much invested in Liberica for the past 5-6 years, and we've been in the coffee industry for about 10 years. So let's jump right into the topic. When I first heard about Liberica coffee 10 years ago, it was still the ugly duckling of the specialty coffee industry. Why do I say that? Because I remember attending a coffee course back then, and one of my instructors, she was a very renowned coffee judge at that time. She described to me Liberica as very bad, right? So I asked her, how do you define bad? And then she said, well, it tasted like rubber tire. You know, it's rubbery, stinky, and like a truck tire. And I still wonder till today what truck tires taste like, you know. I didn't go and lick a truck, don't worry. So also recently, this question came back to me again, so I decided to ask some of the coffee experts and cultivators to recall, like, what do Liberica tasted like by memory in the early days for them, and they were not good as well. Like they recalled a lot of the frequent negative terms that came up were moldy, astringent, potato-like, mineral and chemical characteristics, salted fish. Now we have a very fishy theme today, and also a sort of animal aroma. So this got me thinking, why did Liberica coffee bear such a bad reputation? Is it the problem with the coffee, or is it the people that taste the coffee, or is it the method we use to evaluate the coffee that is responsible? So these are the questions that we will try to explore today. And we will explore it from 3 angles. One is what I could find in the literature, like I mentioned just now to Dr. Carmen. I'm not a researcher, so I'm very limited in my ability to look for all the papers. And I couldn't find much, but I'll share with you what I could find. And second of all is my personal observations of Liberica coffee, being in the industry for 10 years in Malaysia. And thirdly, some of the interesting sensory data that we have collected on Liberica coffee since 2017. So when I look into the coffee-related books and articles, there was very limited material that I could find that discussed the sensory aspects of Liberica. A lot of what we read, I mean, what I could find today is still largely based on impressions from writers and bloggers and even YouTubers. And older articles that mention Liberica's flavor profiles were mostly negative, like I mentioned just now, but I couldn't find anyone who could pinpoint why was it bad. And 2 studies that showed Liberica had higher polyphenols, so just now we've seen this word come up quite often. And what I found is that it's mainly associated with the perception of bitterness and astringency. And when I interviewed Dr. Stefan Schwartz earlier, and he said that phenolic compounds in coffee sensory, in his experience, are often associated with notes of stone fruit, such as mango. And so could phenolic polyphenol contribute to the common fermented taste fruit notes found in Liberica? It's hard to say. And Liberica coffee was also found to have higher antioxidant capacity and lower caffeine content compared to Arabica and Canephora. But I couldn't find any study, like I mentioned just now, that made the sensorial connection between these differences in chemical content and proportions, differences in Liberica, to why it tastes like what it tastes like. Another point worth noting is what Dr. Carmen also mentioned just now, Excelsa, which is currently still recognized as a subvariety of Liberica, had much better flavor profile and tastes more like Arabica on paper. This is what's in the literature. Although many find it hard to differentiate still, Excelsa from Liberica, just like us in Sarawak, we see a lot of different smaller Libericas, which we suspected is Excelsa, but we could not be sure. And some say they are closely related, but independent species. One overview paper that stated the cultivation of Liberica persisted in Malaysia, the Philippines, and parts of Indonesia, as its flavor profile is more accepted and preferred in these regions. Also partly because it was easier to grow in lowland and in the wild. But I did manage to find two papers in these regions that actually talked about sensory of Liberica. So this Indonesian paper published recently showed the effect of fermentation using specific bacteria on the sensory quality of Liberica coffee. The authors evaluated the sensory impact of different fermentation timeframe, and they found that the longer fermentation hours produced higher sensory scores. And this is interesting to see because we have also tasted firsthand some of the Liberica coffee going through prolonged fermentation process, and it really produced a lot of wow factor flavors. But I was also interested in how they actually measure the sensory quality. So I couldn't pull down on the script a little bit. Thank you so much. Yes, so the scores were assigned by 3 panelists using cup grading system by Specialty Coffee Association, SCA, which is predominantly used for assessing Arabica coffee, I want to stress. While certain taste attributes such as sweetness, bitterness may be applicable, but in my opinion, something like fragrance, flavor, and overall impression scores should be maybe assessed differently for Liberica coffee in this context. Another recently published paper, this is in Malaysia, presented local and international preferences towards Liberica coffee under different roast profiles. The researchers concluded that roasting the coffee to 190 degrees Celsius for 22.5 minutes produced the highest sensory scores. But when my partner Kenny, who's the head roaster of our company, saw the paper, he told me he found the results quite questionable, because in his experience, such a long roast duration would sacrifice many of the volatile aromas that are commonly responsible for the fruity and floral notes in a coffee. And I also think because the researchers had used a baking oven in the study to roast their samples, the results probably would not translate well in the real world. But what I'm mostly interested was the sensory evaluation part as well, if I could pull down on the script a bit more. Thank you. So the sensory evaluation in this part was that it was assigned based on the 9-point hedonic scale, and they were assessing color, mouthfeel, aroma, flavor, and overall impression. Unlike the previous study, all the participants in the study were not trained to evaluate coffee. The scores were given purely based on each participant's personal preference, and I don't really see the point in rating the preference in color. The scores for aroma and flavor were also not justified by any qualitative descriptions, giving very little information on how Liberica coffee samples actually taste like under these different roast profiles. So after reading these papers, I'm further convinced of the difficulty in bridging a balance between objectivity and subjectivity in the world of coffee sensory, especially for a rarer species like Liberica. as flavor expectations for this coffee is wildly different from that of Arabicas. So that was Liberica coffee in the ivory tower. It was the most difficult part of my research. Now let us see how it's doing in the market from observation. Liberica, as we know, has been in the shadow of Arabica and Canephora and has never reached more than 2% global market share. But we are starting to see a change in that. So in Malaysia, for example, for the past 10 years, the perception of Liberica coffee is gradually shifting within the specialty coffee industry. Malaysia is a country where Liberica coffee takes up roughly 87% of the whole coffee cultivation, and local coffee demand is rapidly growing. But Malaysia itself is still importing a lot of our coffee that we drink. So I consider myself being in the front seat to witness the shift where traditional Liberica coffee is gradually influenced by this new coffee movement. And it's interesting to see how expectations on taste changes as people start to pay more attention on where the coffee come from. Like the speakers shared earlier, most people don't even know they come from cherries, but that is starting to change. Yeah. So you might ask, what is considered as traditional coffee in Malaysia? In Malaysia, we share similarities in all the Southeast Asian countries. They drink coffee very dark, roasted very dark. In Malaysia, we call it kopi o, and it's produced by roasting the beans with sugar usually and margarine or sometimes even wheat. And the result is usually very, very shiny and dark and can be bitter without adding milk or sugar. So often it's consumed with condensed milk and sugar. And that's the same for a lot of the Malaysian Liberica coffee. It was either served this way or made into an instant coffee. But locals are very used to this charred flavor though, and the super dark roast and sweetened up and oiled up. However, in 2011, we came across a small number of independent coffee roasters and cafes that served Liberica in a pure way without what I've mentioned in a non-traditional way. And those Liberica coffee were roasted lighter and without any additives, and it's a completely experience compared to the traditional way of drinking. But it was a long time ago, so I only had vague impression of it tasting very different to Arabica, and I record strong notes of herbs, fermented fruit, and cinnamon. I didn't hate it, but to be honest, I didn't like it also. But fast forward to 2017, we managed to get our hands on some local Liberica beans from our hometown Sarawak. And we asked the farmers to follow some of the advice we got from Dr. Stefan Schwartz at that time on harvesting and better processing post-harvest. And the outcome was amazing. So we brought some of the samples to the Coffee Summit in Stuttgart the very next year for the many coffee professionals to try in the cupping session. And their feedback was surprisingly good, accompanied by some exotic descriptions such as lychee, jackfruit, and mango. So in the following year, we're very encouraged by the international recognition of Liberica, and we decided to cast more light on it in our hometown by hosting the first Borneo Coffee Symposium and co-hosted the International Liberica Roasting Competition. And the demand was starting to pick up on Liberica, and there was never enough supply, and that was the problem. And that is what we are continuously working on right now with more farmers to try and improve quality and volume at the same time. So Malaysian Liberica coffee is also gaining popularity on the world stage. In 2021, an Australian barista champion named Hugh Kelly won third place in World Barista Championship using Liberica coffee from Jason Leal, our friend from also a Liberica grower in Johor, Malaysia. And this is West Malaysia. The next year, Danny Wilson, another Australian, won fifth place in the World Coffee and Good Spirit event, using the same Liberica coffee in his cocktail beverage. So making a debut in these competitions indicates that certain sensory attributes of Liberica coffee has won the approval of seasoned coffee professionals and experienced judges, despite their Arabica-centric judging standards. But it's also worth noting that both Hugh and Danny only used Liberica coffee as part of their recipes. They didn't serve the coffee alone. And although the hype from winning world titles gave Liberica coffee a flash of global attention, it still has quite some distance to cover for mainstream acceptance in the specialty community. But however, whether we like it or not, Liberica coffee is the only few alternative species that's suitable for lowland cultivation in the face of climate change and the declining production of Arabica and Canephora worldwide. So I think it's important for us to really look at how we should assess this species in a non-biased way that is not the same as Arabica. So let's talk about sensory assessment methods. The SEA SEA cup grading system was the first method I learned to evaluate coffee. Using the cupping form, we score a coffee on its aroma, flavor, aftertaste, acidity, body, balance, and overall impressions. Scores can also be taken away from uniformity of samples, clean cup, and so on. If the final score adds up to 80 and above, the coffee is considered specialty. Anything above 90 is outstanding and rare. So in my opinion, this is a tool useful for coffee buyers and roasters when they need a quick decision on coffee's overall quality and price range. Farmers who learnt to evaluate their own coffee this way will also be better equipped to speak the same language as their buyers and probably help them negotiate on prices better. However, this score-based system is also fallible and can be misused if the user isn't properly trained or calibrated among other cup tasters. Score given in the aroma and flavor category, for example, can also be biased even with training and calibration. And as one flavor aroma may be appreciated in this culture, and it might be frowned upon in another. Sorry, can I just scroll down the... My apologies. So take stinky tofu, for example. If you have never heard of it, it's like the blue cheese in Asia. You either love it or hate it. When such ambivalent flavors appear in a coffee, one's likes and dislikes could unconsciously impact the final score on an assessment. And that wouldn't be fair for Liberica as an independent species. So I later came across Coffee Consulate's method of evaluating coffee based on describing flavors instead of giving it a score. I find it very useful when I assess coffees that are unfamiliar to me with an open mind. So on the left of the form, if you could read, it assessed the gustatory properties of mouthfeel of a coffee. And a number is assigned here just for the intensity of each of these properties. On the right, if we zoom in a little bit, you may explore the olfactory properties of a coffee. Sensory references are provided for every category of aroma, and the assessor is to find as many attributes as possible in each category. You're encouraged to include aromas that are not provided in the references, and the number here is also just for marking the intensity. So this method was also put to use in our International Liberica Roasting Competition that I mentioned earlier, with Dr. Schwartz leading a panel of coffee experts from different countries. And some of the judges were using this cupping form for the first time. But they were able to pick up very quickly, for it's very straightforward and simple to use. Most judges find the cupping form surprisingly useful when assessing Liberica, because it exhibited many unfamiliar flavor notes to them, and the reference guide helped them to identify relatable aromas. So allow me to share with you parts of the compiled sensory attributes from the different roast samples of Sarawak Liberica coffee in this competition. First, we look at the fruit aroma groups, and as you can see, there's a heavy presence of tropical fruits and stone fruits in this coffee, with mango that came up the top. And we also have 4 clear winners in the floral and herb groups. Next, we can see a wide variety of sensory attributes picked up by the judges in 5 other categories, with almond, ginger, cinnamon, acacia wood, vanilla, and dark chocolate topping the charts. In the last 3 groups, we see 2 very high numbers. I often associate these attributes with defects or an undesirable character in the SEA flavor. But carrot, cream, and sherry from these groups don't sound all too bad to me. But this is a purely descriptive tool, so there's no positive or negative connotations behind any associated aroma. The judges were later asked, though, to rank and vote independently for the samples they liked the most, and that's how we came up with the winner at the end. So, although this descriptive method encouraged assessors to incorporate aromas not included in the reference, I think it would be useful to add in new aroma references depending on the type of coffees that we'll assess in the future and where the assessment is conducted, because localized versions of the cupping form would help users to think outside of the norms and embrace more descriptors associated with local subjects. I'm also aware of the effort put forward by World Coffee Research. They adopted a similar descriptive approach in their coffee century lexicon, and that is applied in the SEA flavor wheel. However, it was developed based on purely Arabica coffee samples, from my understanding, so it may be limited at this point to assess other species, such as Liberica. I do like the idea, however, of having physical attribute references to standardize the taste connections. It would help researchers to make those sensory connections with more repeatability. They do encourage users to submit new sensory attributes and relatable references. Some of the most existing references are only accessible in the US. So on this note, I would like to quickly share with you some of the novel sensory attributes we've collected.
Raven, could you do it very quickly?
Yep.
We are already over time.
I noticed that, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm just going to share with you very quickly on some of the attributes we've collected from the cupping records we've collected and some of the descriptions from internal training and from coffeeologist educations and interviews from coffee cultivators and scientists. So here are the most frequent appeared novel sensory attributes laid out in the aroma categories. So a lot of the terms you might struggle to pronounce even, and that is exactly the point I wanted to bring across here, because there are a lot of novel sensory experiences based in different cultures that we could use to describe a coffee such as Liberica. So if we just look quickly through the fruit group, these are some of the common fruits associated with Liberica. Jackfruit is probably more familiar to you. Durian, some of you might be brave enough to try that. Some of you don't like it. And dry longan, rambutan, salicas. These are slightly more sweet and acidic compared to the previous group, and very rare, more sour and subtle aroma fruits. And then we have sour and alcohol fermented group. Duak is a traditional rice wine, and these desserts also made from fermenting rice and cassava. And very interesting in the oil, green and vegetable category, we find these rare tree oil characters, and dabai is a kind of date, although people call it olives. It's got this very nice fatty umami flavor. And in the nut category, we have the fruits I mentioned just now. The seeds could be boiled or fried, and you could actually get a nut out of it. And they taste like no other nuts in my experience. Last but not least, we all need some sweetness in life and in our coffee. So in these two groups, we have two types of sugars very commonly used in Southeast Asia, palm and coconut sugar. and also a honey from stingless bee called Kalulut. So these are the only part of the terms we've collected over the years, unlike Robusta, where a generic flavor is always identifiable no matter where it's grown. We find Liberica to be more like Arabica because it has more terroir influences. When we taste Liberica from East and West Malaysia, they taste different. From Indonesia, India, and the Philippines, the difference is very wide. We're also working with farmers from Sarawak, and we realized that Liberica coffee grown on a higher elevation is in general cleaner compared to flatland. Different processing methods also played a huge part, and we've recently kickstarted anaerobic processing of our own, and it produced some wild flavors as well. So to conclude my talk today, I'm sorry for taking so much time, I think we need to acknowledge the gap between sensory attribute studies done in a lab and those that are assessed by industrial players like myself, as it's like trying to convert scientific assessment into aesthetic judgments. When done improperly, useful values often get lost in the process. So these are the limitations I see in the current score-based grading system with no clear flavor descriptors. So with all that being said, tasting is believing, so I'm happy to announce that we brought some very rare samples of Liberica coffee from Malaysia. They are from different regions, elevations, and processing methods for a cupping session later, which you can experience. And I would like you to invite all of you to contribute to the Century Lexicon for Liberica by filling up an online questionnaire, if that's allowed, just from this QR code. If you could find some novel descriptors from the Liberica we'll taste later, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raven, for your exciting insight into the flavors of Liberica. And I must say that I have no association with most of your tastes.
Yes, so please come to Borneo.
So probably if I give you my impressions, you will also have difficulties to understand this intercultural flavor descriptors. But this is, I think, not only a problem in Liberica, but generally. So perhaps we can allow one very quick question. Otherwise, I would like to ask you to state the questions during the longer coffee break with the Liberica tasting, which we have later, and perhaps for time reasons move on to the next. But first, you also get your... Thank you.